Hey there, thanks for tuning in. So today we're going to talk about the A7s and how it compares to the 6K, because I've been using the 6K since it came out and I always loved the camera. I loved the image it produced and also loved how easy it is to use. But after a while I started missing some features, like for example autofocus. Well, I know, real filmmakers don't use autofocus, but let's be straight for a second. When choosing gear, your main focus should be on usability. So it might not always be the greatest option to use a manual focusing system and manual cinema lenses. At least in my case, I shoot a lot of corporate stuff, some documentary stuff, and mostly there's not a ton of crew around. And sometimes I have to do stuff alone. And it made absolute sense for me to switch to a camera that could do stuff automatically. So could make my life easier in these situations. So for that reason, this video won't be about image quality. It's gonna be about usability in the real world and how it compares to the Pocket 6K's usability. We'll get into firmware, form factor, and special features each camera has. Also, I'm gonna introduce you to my workarounds for the major flaws the A7S III has, because it's not a perfect camera at all. But for now, let's start with firmware. Blackmagic is known for always improving their products with firmware updates. And the menu, it doesn't have tons of options, but I think just enough. Now looking at the A7S, a lot of people are not a fan of the Sony menu, and neither am I. But I have to say, after using it for a couple of hours, it's not that bad. There are tons of options you can configure your camera to and make it very versatile. But I have some issues with the firmware. The first thing I noticed has to do with HDMI monitors. So when plugging in a monitor on the A7S, you have two options. You can either go for a clean image, or you can go for HDMI info display on, which is going to show all of the icons and settings and basically everything you see on the screen, which would be alright, but the thing is, the Sony screen is a 4:3 screen and the image it sends out, it does not get scaled at all. So on your 16:9 monitor you have a 4:3 image, which is kind of a joke. For me that's not an option, so I'm definitely going to use the clean image. But there, of course, I don't see my exposure settings or frame rates or even if I'm recording or not. So I always have to check the Sony screen, which is kind of annoying. Now let's have a look at the camera's internal tools. Both cameras offer things like peaking or zebras. The 6K even does false color and LUTs. On the 6K I always use the function buttons to display different overlays on my HDMI monitor. And you see your settings. Or you don't see them depending on what you want, so it's all up to you. The Sony has function buttons too. You can also configure them to different overlays like zebras or peaking. Of course, on the clean image you don't see anything but the image, so you have to enable the HDMI info display. But the thing is, on your external screen, things like zebras or peaking simply do not show up, even though everything else is mirrored, which doesn't make sense at all in my eyes. Now let's get into the playback menu. I really loved the playback menu on the 6K. You could scrub through your clip, you could navigate quickly, you can enable LUTs or false color on your playback, punch in to check focus, and it's just the way it's supposed to be. Not so great on the A7S. You cannot scrub through the clip, even though it has a touchscreen which works surprisingly well. And if I shoot a long interview, many different clips, and I just want to simply go through them quickly and scrub through, it will take me a long time to find a specific position or a specific clip. A small thing I'm missing on the A7S is the 180-degree shutter setting. It can get you into a lot of trouble if you quickly switch between frame rates and you forget your shutter speed. And then there is a silly but still annoying issue. The A7S has dual card slots, which is great. But if you only have one card in the camera will always show you a warning. And depending on your view, you only see that warning, even if you're recording. So I don't know about you, but the information I would care about while recording is how many minutes I've left on the card inside the camera and not that there is a card missing. And if you have one CFast Express card and one a bit slower but still very fast SD card inside, the camera will also show you a warning every time you turn it on or switch between modes. These are minor things, but they all add up and make it quite annoying and feel like Sony doesn't really care about these things. The 6K definitely wins this section. Everything really feels just thought through, and it feels like it was made for using with an HDMI monitor. Only elements that make sense are displayed, and only in the right place. Whereas the A7S III just really feels like a stills camera with an HDMI port. Compared to big cinema camera bodies, both cameras are quite compact and lightweight. But I will say that a camera's form factor depends heavily on its battery life. And as we know, the Pocket 6K's battery life is just terrible. It lasts like 30-40 minutes on one charge, meaning it has to be hooked up to a V-mount battery. And after all the rigging is done, it's not so pocket anymore. For long days of shooting handheld, it can be really straining. The A7S has much better battery life. You can get through a full day of shooting on 2 or maybe 3 batteries, and it can be rigged much lighter. Also, it's a big advantage on gimbals, because on gimbals it's even harder to connect external batteries. And also the 6K is really wide, which can be a disadvantage on certain gimbals. I personally prefer the smaller, more compact form factor of the Sony. Each camera has special abilities. Let's start with the A7S. As someone who shoots a lot of handheld stuff, it's so good to have in-body stabilization. Before a lot of time I used IS lenses, and when I didn't for handheld stuff, it tended to look shaky and not that professional. It even allows you to make small dolly kind of moves without using a gimbal on the Sony. Next up, autofocus. And like I mentioned before, this was one of the big reasons to go for the A7S III. The autofocus system in the Sony is brilliant, and actually one of the few systems that work well. I shoot a lot of talking head stuff, and sometimes I set up a second camera, but I don't have a second camera person with me. So having the ability to just set up a camera and know it's going to keep the person in focus is such a big relief. On the 6K you really always need to pull focus manually. And if you put the camera on a gimbal or a slider, you're not going to be able to touch it, so you need a remote focusing system. And maybe even a wireless video transmission system, and a second monitor to pull focus on. So more and more gear and more helping hands, whereas the A7S does it all by itself. Now let's talk about ISO for a moment. Both cameras have dual ISO, even though Sony won't confirm it officially. On the 6K it's 400 and 3200, and on the Pocket 6K it is 640 and 12800, which sounds insane to have a second native ISO this high, but after using it for a couple of projects, I felt like 12800 was almost too high sometimes and too bright. So if there is some light available and it's not pitch black, you need to stop down your lens or use ND, which sounds weird doing that in low light. If I could choose, I would probably go for a second native ISO at 6400, which might be much more realistic. But I actually found a pretty cool trick for the Sony. If you shoot documentary style and switch between inside and outside shooting, you would have to put on or take off ND all the time. But on the Sony, if you're outside, you add ND and put the camera on 640 ISO. Then you can go inside, leave the ND on, and just crank up the ISO to 12800, which is almost like having a reverse internal ND filter. Moving on to audio ports. The 6K has 2 audio ports, and one of them is a mini XLR with phantom power, which is a big plus in usability. I've used it many times with 2 mics, one on-camera mic and one wireless lav mic on the Mini XLR. The A7S only has 1 audio input, so that's definitely something I will miss there. Also, even though it's not super bright, the 6K screen is just big enough to make it usable in certain situations where you just want to use this without an external one. The Sony screen is, for me at least, too small for that. Also, we could discuss about the flip screen. I'm personally not a fan of it. I would have preferred a tilt-up screen, but that's just me. Considering that the 6K screen cannot move at all, it's fine. And of course, the ability to record directly to SSDs gives the 6K another advantage. You can save a ton of money you'd spend on expensive CFast cards otherwise. And finally, recording options. The 6K records ProRes and even RAW internally, whereas the A7S does only more compressed formats. The XAVCSI codec of the Sony A7S, which is its highest bitrate codec, generates much smaller file sizes than ProRes while maintaining a decent quality. In fact, it is half of ProRes 422 and almost a third of ProRes HQ. But it does come at a price because the more compressed footage will be heavier on your workstation. And yes, there are more features the A7S III has, like for example 120 FPS in 10-bit 422, or the ability to save gyroscopic data into your files for post-production stabilization, or the fact that it's a full-frame camera, or it's really fast rolling shutter. And for the 6K, like the name implies, it does 6K resolution. But these are all things that don't make it a better camera necessarily, it just means they are different. The A7S might just be a bit more versatile. So who is it for then? If you do a lot of handheld stuff and you tend to be more often in situations where you don't have a huge crew, you might be really happy with the A7S. The 6K is still a great camera. The fact that it's missing autofocus and IBIS doesn't mean it's a weakness per se, it just means you're gonna have to work in a different way with it and you might need more helping hands to handle all the manual stuff. So let's say you're considering getting the A7S III. How can we fix all the issues? For the missing additional audio input, there is a very nice and simple solution. Sony sells an XLR hot shoe adapter, which gives you two full-size XLR inputs, and it has excellent preamps as well. Also, the internal audio input stays unused, and unused ports are a good thing on this camera because the screen can get in the way. To fix the issues with HDMI monitors and playback, we can kill two birds with one stone. And you could probably literally kill birds with this, because it is heavy. Don't do it though. The Atomos Ninja 5. The touchscreen is responsive, the OS feels great, and you can easily enable tools like zebras, peaking, false color, and even LUTs. And what it also can do is record. In fact, it records ProRes and even ProRes RAW. But almost more important, you finally get a proper playback on your Sony A7S III. You can scrub through the clips, you can navigate easily, you can punch in and check focus, you can enable different overlays. It's almost as good as on the Pocket 6K. The Ninja 5 records to an SSD, which of course means you need to record on camera but also on the monitor. But this is not a big deal because you can automatically trigger the monitor with the camera's trigger. Unfortunately, you still don't see your exposure settings or frame rate. For that, you're still gonna have to check the Sony screen, but at least you can see if you're recording or not. By the way, the Ninja 5 has internal fans to keep it cool. So it's not completely silent, so just keep that in mind. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, hit the like button, and if you want to see more stuff, please subscribe to the channel. Also, feel free to leave a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. See ya!